Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ronnie Munck. I have been head of civic engagement at DCU for the last 10 years. In that capacity, I've been part of the Council of Europe working party that has been tasked with the promotion of the democratic and locally engaged university across the European space. So you're all very welcome. This is an event in two parts. I will be facilitating a roundtable discussion with some of my co-editors and co-authors of this book. But for now, we're very pleased to have Minister Simon Harris here to formally launch the book onto the high seas. But first of all, he will be introduced by Professor Dara Keogh, President of DCU. I don't think I need to introduce him, but I would just say that from my own point of view, having a champion for the social, for the community, for the civic engagement at the very top of the institution really does make all the difference. So we're delighted, Dara, to welcome Minister Harris. Dara.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, for that very warm welcome, and thank you for the point at the end about engagement. I know we're so used to the virtual world at this point. My only regret today is that everybody isn't here with us on a beautiful day here on the beautiful campus on the north side of Dublin. The picture behind me is the building that I'm in at the moment. It's Albert College. This is a relatively young university. It's only 20-something years since we received our charter, but we have a long legacy in education across a number of fields. And this building is called after Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's consort. The reason I choose this today is to make a point, I suppose, and as a historian, we usually begin with history. In the middle of the 19th century, in 1845 to 52, Ireland suffered an incredible natural disaster. We know it as An Gorta Mór, or the Great Famine. It was a milestone, I suppose, in terms of Irish history, but also in the development, I suppose, of the English-speaking world and the growth of Irish America. Over the course of those years, as a consequence of natural disaster, the potato blight, but also colonial mismanagement, 1 million people died of starvation and another million were forced to emigrate. Commentators at the time spoke about 1 million people being sacrificed on the altar of free trade. It was a massive natural disaster that, as I say, changed the course of Irish history, but in some ways the history of the English-speaking world. But the significance I want to highlight today is that in the aftermath of that crisis, Prince Albert came to this building, Albert College, to study agriculture and how through education, through agriculture, the world could build back and build back better. So there is a precedent, I suppose, for monumental disasters like this, forcing a change and highlighting the role and significance of education. So as a place-based university, I'm very pleased to set our discussion today in the physical context of Albert College here at DCU. And we're very pleased to have with us today our Ireland's first Minister for Higher Education, Simon Harris, who will launch the book. In terms of the pandemic, of course, the Minister has a wonderful insight because he began last year as Minister for Health through the crisis, and when his new coalition government, a historic government in itself that brought together former Civil War rivalries and a new government to rebuild, the Minister was appointed First Minister for Higher Education in this kind of new coalition. So I'm really delighted to introduce the Minister, and I know that he will bring his insights from both portfolios to this launch. So it's great pleasure for me to introduce Minister Harris.
Thanks so much, Professor Keogh, as President of DCU, for inviting me to be here with you today. And I'm delighted to be paying my first virtual visit to DCU. I did have an opportunity to get out and physically see you back when restrictions were easier, and I really look forward to having a chance to come back out and see you all on your wonderful campus on the north side of our capital city. I want to just acknowledge at this event, because often we don't get an opportunity to, I just want to acknowledge the incredible role DCU plays in our higher education ecosystem. DCU is an excellent, growing, thriving university. It's a valued university. It's one we take great pride in here in our country. But it's more than that as well. It's a university that has at its very core and very ethos decided, and not accidentally, but made a conscious decision to place inclusion at the heart of all you do. And I really want to commend Dublin City University for that today. We often don't get opportunities enough to acknowledge and call out excellence. And I really just want to thank Dara and his team for the leadership that DCU plays, not just as a higher education institution, but also, as Ronnie says, for reaching out, linking with our community and civically engaging on so many issues as well. I also want to thank you at the launch of the Council of Europe book for your own passionate advocacy in relation to the European Universities Initiative. And indeed, I know you've written to me recently about how we must even be more ambitious, and save me responding, though I will in due course. Let me agree with you. I think there is so much more that we need to do in terms of linking with colleagues in the higher education space right across Europe through that European Universities Initiative. And I look forward to DCU continuing to play a leadership role in that. I wanted to be here today as your minister and as a member of the Irish government to really thank the university sector for the leadership role that you've played throughout the pandemic. As you said, I can see it somewhat uniquely, both from the perspective of a former Minister for Health at the start of the pandemic and now as Ireland's Minister for Further and Higher Education and Research and Innovation. Because when I started trying to address the issue of COVID, I saw the massive leadership role that our universities played, where overnight they offered personal protective equipment, they offered laboratories, they offered excellence, they offered brilliance, they offered insight and expertise to try and bring our best and our brightest together to get on top of it. They offered very, very practical things as well. And again, I just want to thank you and acknowledge that as well. And you did all that at the same time as you were having to shift your own delivery of services almost overnight. From an in-person, face-to-face model to one that was going to take place in many cases almost exclusively for a period of time online as well, with very restricted access to your own facilities. And that brought about huge change for institutions, huge change for staff, huge change for students. And today, in my role as Minister for Further and Higher Education, I'm delighted to see our university sector continue to play a very practical role in helping our national effort in relation to COVID-19. And I'm conscious that at an event with DCU, your own campus, your own Helix, is being used as a vaccination hub, bringing people into DCU to give them the gift of protection from this horrific virus that has brought so much misery, not just to our shores, but to pretty much every shore right across this globe as well. So, Gurav Mila Mohagov, thank you so much to DCU. Thank you so much to everybody involved in higher education for the leadership role you've played at the start of the pandemic and that you continue to play right throughout the pandemic. We have seen the brilliance of the higher education system in our living rooms, every night on television screens, providing expert advice to the people of this country and participating in public discourse as well. So thank you very much for all of that. I think the launch of this book could not come at a better time, and I presume that's why we're launching it now, because whilst the pandemic is not yet over, we are daring to dream again. We are daring to begin to plan our lives again. We're daring to begin to think, what could life post-pandemic look like? And I really, really believe that successful societies, successful economies will be those that invest in and embrace talent, scientific research, creativity, knowledge creation, and learn how to successfully use those skills to improve society and to sustain and grow our economy into the future. This has never been clearer than in dealing with the challenges we face with COVID-19. It has become so apparent to everybody that research, innovation, higher education isn't some abstract thing over there done in ivory towers. It's a very real and meaningful thing that has an impact. It's a very real and meaningful services that has an impact on every single person's life. And it is so important that we're going to need to support that and that we're going to need to collaborate more and more. If something good has come out of the pandemic, it surely has to be the importance of multilateralism. Whether you're a big country or a small country, whether you're a rich country or a poor country, you can't do these things on your own. The challenges facing the world are far too big for anyone to go it alone. And therefore, we need to look at every possible opportunity to build our research networks, to collaborate at a European level, to collaborate right across the globe, to use organizations like the OECD and the United Nations more and more. And I think the Bologna process is a clear representation of the enormous benefits that come from our countries and our systems working closely together. And as I've already referenced, the European Universities Initiative provides us with a model for collaboration in which learning, studying, and research are not restricted by geographic distances. I believe in the urgency of embracing the digital future for higher education right now and in strengthening our systems based on data. Our higher education systems must equip our students with the skills for the digital world, and we must embrace the benefits and the opportunities provided by new technologies. We can no longer, as a world, just tut-tut at the changes and the challenges that are coming. We must think, how can we harness these for good? How can we put these to work for a better higher education system and, quite frankly, a better society? So I want to thank everybody who has come together for the launch of this book, who has come together to bring about this book, to edit the book. I know there has been a tremendous work and amount of work and reflection gone into its development. I can assure you it's a book that will be at all times nearby me on a windowsill in an office, because I think this is something we're going to be dipping in and out of as we plan our higher education systems post-pandemic as well. The impressive caliber of contributors and the importance of the topics included will ensure that this is a publication that will be widely read by the academic community, no doubt, but will be much more widely read than just that. This is a book that can really help us plan for our future. I really like the fact that this book talks about, in its own words, our immediate past and our present, but does so with an eye to the future. And I think that's exactly right. We need to take stock of what we have been through in relation to COVID-19, but we need to not just record what we've been through. We need to ask, what are the lessons learned? I bristle when I hear people asking, when are we going back to normal? And if normal means all the things we're missing in life, I'm up for that. We all like to go back to that. But going back to normal is far too underambitious when it comes to policymakers and when it comes to leaders in our university and higher education systems. Out of every big adverse event in the world, some good has come. And I would put the challenge to all of us that this is our time as a sector. This is the time for higher education, research, science, innovation to take its place, to go to the top of the queue in terms of priority, because we have shown as a sector, and the pandemic has shown as a sector, the importance of investing in ingenuity, in talent, and in innovation. And I just want to provide maybe a brief reflection on some of the issues that have been raised in the book. So firstly, the book deals with our pandemic response. And again, I find myself wanting to say thank you. I want to say thank you to all our lecturers, all our academic staff, all our ancillary staff, and our students who worked to keep the show on the road, quite frankly, during the midst of the pandemic. Yes, lectures moved online. Things were done very differently, but educational standards were maintained. And I want to acknowledge that, and I want to thank people for that. But I also want to say, in terms of an eye to the future, where we're at now can't be sustained much longer. We need our students back on busy campuses. Education is not about Zoom cameras and box rooms and looking down a camera at a laptop on the corner of a kitchen table. Education is about development. Education is about sitting down with a cup of coffee and debating and discussing an issue with your peers. Education is about social development and personal growth. And I just want everybody on this call from DCU, from our higher education sector, to know we're going back to campus. And we're going back to campus at the start of the new academic year. And we need to make sure that that happens, because we need to move from the crisis response to a much more sustainable one. The second topic I think is really interesting in the book is the whole idea of internationalization. We have become more interdependent as the days go by, and the direction of travel will be very clear. We're going to become more and more and more dependent as technologies bring us in that way. Ireland wants to be prepared for that. We're going to develop our new international education strategy, where we look at how we reach out to the world and how we continue to promote Ireland as a destination for learning. And in terms of looking at our post-pandemic response, we need to be very careful as policymakers that we don't put any measures in place that cut us off from the rest of the world. And any such measures that need to be put in place for public health can only be in place for a very short time and cannot become medium-term policy objectives. Because for this small island that prides itself as an international island, an innovative island, to disconnect in any way from the rest of the world would be perilous and dangerous and can't happen. The third issue is the issue of finance. If ever before there was a way of making the case for investing properly in higher education, the pandemic has done this. And I want people to know we are going to settle the question this year as to how you sustainably fund higher education in Ireland. Not a sticking plaster, not something to tick us by for a few months, a proper sustainable model of funding. And again, we've done that by engaging with colleagues in the European Commission, and we're due to receive the very final report, because we don't need many more, the very final report on sustainable models of funding for higher education, probably as soon as next month. And just 3 other quick topics. This book really highlights the importance of academic freedom. And I couldn't come to an event in DCU without standing full square behind academic freedom, because I am appalled at what I see in recent days by any political attempts or geopolitical attempts to stand in the way of academic freedom. And I want the academic staff in DCU to know that I stand full square behind them individually and behind Dublin City University as an institution in terms of defending academic freedom. And we will always be there. And any day we're in a different place is a very dangerous place. Fifthly, the issue of research. We now need to invest and plan when it comes to research in a way like never before. I'm proud to be Ireland's Minister for Research. I'm embarrassed by our levels of funding for public research. And I'm working very closely and very intensively with Taoiseach to seek to rectify that. And as a dividend for the people of Ireland and as a dividend for our country in contributing to a post-pandemic world, I think we're going to have good news on research funding very, very shortly, where I want to make sure this country funds public research at least at the level of the European average. And we've got to be prepared also, as we emerge from this pandemic, that people are going to look to our sector to help them rebuild their lives. There are people who have lost their jobs. There are people who were in a job that they believed was a job for life, who overnight saw that job go. And more people are going to look to further education and higher education for an opportunity to get their life back on track. And what I would say to all of us as a collective challenge is we need to make sure that we put in place education in a way that is flexible and agile enough to provide for all types of learners. Lifelong learning is not just a slogan. More and more people are going to need to dip in and out of education at different stages of their life. And some of them won't be able to pack their bags and head to university for 3 or 4 years. They will need to access education in new, different, innovative and flexible ways. DCU is a leader in this area, but we will need all of us to do even more in this space. And very finally, COVID-19 did not create inequality in the world. It did not create inequality in Ireland, but it did shine a massive bright light on inequality. And now that we have seen what we have seen, we can never unsee it. So no back to normal, no when are we going back to the way things used to be. The people of this country and the people of this world have suffered so much with COVID. They look to us, all of us, to make sure that we build a better world and a more inclusive world. And what I would say is there is no greater leveler in the world than education. And if we can collectively get our act together, for want of a better phrase, in terms of policies, plans and funding here in Ireland and across the globe, I really believe we can enter a post-COVID world in which higher education will play a massive role that we will all be proud of as to how we build a more sustainable, resilient, inclusive society. It is my great honor to launch this wonderful book, Higher Education's Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic, Building a More Sustainable and Democratic Future. I thank everybody who has worked so hard on it. I really look forward to learning from it and its expertise, and I hope many, many people will do likewise. Cahordagus, congratulations, Gurmila Magov. Thank you very much.
Minister Harris, that has been an impressive launch and much food for thought, reassuring thoughts on issues of funding and so on. But the one I personally would like most, this idea of there is no going back to normal. Psychologically, people feel the need to go back to the status quo ante, but it wasn't terribly normal. It wasn't terribly equitable. So I also like the idea of the leveler university. Derek Yole will remember the resonances in terms of the English Civil War and the levelers, but no, we won't go there. Mr. Harris, that was terrific. And it's very good of you to have come today, taken time for your busy schedule. We now have to move to another modality, which is what universities do well or should do well, which is to have a discussion, a debate, a free debate around some of the themes in the book. So I would like to welcome the panelists, Darren Keogh, now with a different hat on him, the hat as author, one of the authors in the book, Dorothy Kelly, Vice President for Internationalization at the University of Granada, Hilligje van Lant, Secretary General of the International Association of Universities, and last but not least, Sjur Bergan, Head of Education at the Council of Europe, and a colleague, both him and Hilligje, co-editors on this book. So you're all very welcome. We now have to pick up the challenge from the Minister and see how we move ahead. My own sense, I think widely shared amongst us, is that the COVID crisis is very much a watershed. There is a before and after. There is no going back to normal. It's neither an option, it's not desirable either. We've all said that higher education has reacted very well. However, where does that leave us now? How do we build the sustainable university? And sustainable in all senses, addressing the global crisis of sustainability, obviously the financial sustainability, but the one I see in my capacity at DCU is the wear and tear on staff that this last year has created. So how do we care for people? How do we care for our students moving forward? So that's just by way of backdrop. Dara, if that's okay, I'm going to ask you to kick off, and we have agreed amongst ourselves to do sort of chat show format, nice, short, sharp interventions to allow time for questions and comments later. Dara, in your chapter, you talk about the university needing to be connected, but you also say that the university needs to be locally rooted. What does that mean to you concretely and in general?
Yeah, I overnight saw a quote from our partners in Arizona State University. The president of ASU, Michael Crow, who many of you will know, spoke about the impact of the pandemic and the way in which the technology has changed and I suppose brought our values to the fore. And he spoke about universities as communities of open-minded, creative people who can do anything. And he had a nice quote where he spoke about the technology and the affordance of technology. And he says, we're not a place anymore, we are a force. And I think that we get the sense around the room, whether you're in, I see colleagues in Chicago there, I see colleagues in Georgia, all over the place. That sense that all of us around the room have shared values and together we will do things. And that point that Mike Crow makes about we are not a place, we are a force. That's the kind of tension that many of us feel, because all of our institutions and all of us, whether in the Council of Europe or European universities or international universities, we are conscious of the kind of global imperative that we think globally, but at the same time, I think we're most effective when we're place-based universities. And for us, for DCU, we're very much place-based. We were founded in this community and with the imperatives of the community and the needs of the community absolutely at our core. Our mission is to transform lives and societies. And that society for us, when we were established, was this area of North Dublin, which was deprived. But from that initial foundation, we have moved ourselves, as I say, into a global position. As you say, Ronnie, we're civically engaged. That's our DNA. And I think what the pandemic has brought home to us is that sense of a shared humanity and the absolute imperative of sustainability that the pandemic has brought home to us, our kind of humanity, the importance of sustainability in real terms, the fragility of the earth, our common home, and as the Minister said, the opportunity to build the world as it should be. So as I say, in place-based universities, we deal with citizens, civic universities, but we're not citizens of nowhere, we're citizens of places. And the issues that affect the world affect us too. So we have, for instance, embedded the Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of our teaching and learning, our research and our People First agenda. We adopt those with our community and bring them out. In that context, I'd like to congratulate, I see the president of UCC, University College Cork is with us. And today Cork were ranked number 8 in the world for impact with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's not just because John says we need to get there in the rankings. That's because of decades of commitment of a university like theirs to the people of Cork, to the region. And we can see it here, where people talk about universities as ivory towers, but that's a caricature. I suppose ivory towers, give us an ivory tower, Oxford maybe. And yet who was first out of the blocks with the vaccine for the world? The quintessential ivory tower, Oxford itself. So I would reject those notions that all of us as universities are committed to our people. And that metaphor, I think, is that the universities in the modern world are like the castles in the medieval world. They're the anchor of the region. They're the source of security of the region, the engines of the economy of the region, all of those things. But what we need, unlike the castle, we don't need walls. We need that kind of genuine partnership. It involves empathy. It involves vulnerability. It involves kind of a symbiotic relationship. That engagement with our region or with the people is not a third force, but it's in the essence of what we do, and that sense of being together.
Dara, thank you ever so much. A lot of thoughts there and metaphors. The one about the anchor institutions is one that has been used quite a lot in the global network of these universities. I think that's a very good one. And the old environmental slogan of thinking globally and acting locally, these things are very much coming back. Thank you very much. I'll now move on to Dorothy Kelly, whose chapter was about internationalization in the book, is about that. You heard our minister talk about Ireland as inevitably engaged internationally, but you raised the issue that maybe in its current form it's not sustainable, maybe it presents opportunities for innovation. Could you expand a little bit on that? What would be the new format for internationalization or modality? Dorothy.
Sure, Ronnie, thank you. And thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today with colleagues, co-authors of the volume and colleagues from universities and the higher education sector around the world. I think one of the points that I tried to make in the chapter in the book was precisely that the pandemic, when it hit universities, hit internationalization very hard, in that, of course, it hit physical mobility very hard. And physical mobility has been a traditional driver of internationalization. And so there was a sort of immediate crisis, an immediate response to a critical situation, which I think in the first few months also was a very inward-looking and very national approach to solving the problems. But I think slowly we have come around to the interplay between the local, the global, and the solutions, the local solutions and the global solutions, as both President Keogh and Minister Harris have commented. Now, I think that we've been speaking about lessons learned, and I think that in this particular case, there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And one of the things the pandemic has very clearly brought home to us is that physical mobility as the only pillar for internationalization is not sustainable. It's not sustainable because it is not inclusive, because it is not environmentally sustainable. And particularly if we look at the European higher education area, the objective for 2020 was 20% of graduates with a significant international experience. And that objective has been pushed back a further 4 years. But even if we had attained that objective across the whole European higher education area, that would still mean that we had 80% of our graduates without a significant international experience. And I think this is something the pandemic has helped us to remember. I think it has helped us to remember that internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum, comprehensive internationalization, various different approaches to a very similar issue have been on the agenda since the end of the 1990s. They're not new, but the pandemic has helped us to learn that technology does actually allow us to do a lot of the things which experts in internationalization at home, experts in internationalization of the curriculum have been encouraging us to do since the late 90s. We have learned how to make effective use of virtual exchange. We have learned, and we have seen that in the future, blended mobility will certainly be on the cards, that there is a need in this interconnected world for us to introduce intercultural and international learning outcomes. And I'm pretty sure that one of the lessons that we will take away from the pandemic is precisely that we don't necessarily want to return to the old normal, where internationalization was based very heavily on mobility, but rather we want to combine the benefits of physical mobility with all of these new forms of internationalization, as long as they are quality forms of internationalization. And just very briefly there to remind us all that the online teaching at a foreign university, which took place in the early months of the pandemic and is still happening to quite some extent throughout the world today, is not true collaborative online international learning. It's an emergency response. So again, here we have a challenge in the quality of these new forms of internationalization.
I better unmute. Thank you very much, Dorothy. That's a very nuanced view, and the whole issue of interculturalism is something that in DCU would be seen as very welcome. There's a question there in the panel from Darren McDermott, which is probably directed to you, but we can go back to that when we have finished all our panelists' addresses. Thank you very much, Dorothy. Hilligje, co-editor, co-author. You have a hard task with the international title. I'm not going to ask you. Well, I mean, I am going to ask you. Do you see an international pattern in the reactions to COVID, or are places so different that you can't really have a pattern? And within that question, the issue we've talked a lot about of inequalities. In your observations, in talking to university leaders throughout the world, in assessing the situation, for example, South Africa, South America, is the question of inequality coming to the fore? And if so, what do we do about it? That's a question for all of us, obviously. Hilligje, over to you, please, from your experience.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here with you on to talk to this esteemed audience. Very pleased to see that so many people are interested in this particular session as well. And we started off very strongly. I hope, if I may say so before I forget, it would be really nice to have the opportunity to reread the messages that the Minister Harris did share. And if he had a text, it would be really nice, I believe, to share when sharing the recording of this session, because he had very good points he made. And I very much liked his enormous support for higher education as a key stakeholder in our societies today. We need many more of those ministers, so let's hope he can emulate elsewhere, and the text would be a good start. He had one of the points, I think it was his 7 points, where he said that COVID did not raise inequality, or was not at the source of inequality today. He said that COVID actually has, and I did not write it all perfectly down, but he said that COVID has shed massive light on inequality, and we need to build a better and more inclusive world, and that higher education is one of the key stakeholders in making that happen. And it is true that inequality has been there for long, but there was a lot underway to address that. It is also one of the key aspects behind in the philosophy of Agenda 2030, transforming our world and all the SDGs. It is part and parcel of all these different aspects, in particular in SDG 4, where education is to be considered as the pillar for building the future in a different way. And not because we need to change education as such, but to change the world in which we live, and higher education is on the right path. And President Keogh did make that point very strongly as well. So thank you for making that case as well. The little film that you showed at the beginning, I found very interesting, as I thought that the points that you made in that little movie were inclusivity, you showed diversity, you included interdisciplinarity, you put a lot of emphasis on culture, on equal opportunities. I found that really very interesting as a statement to the world also via video. Where does my perspective come from? Ronnie, you ask what the rectors, the presidents say around the world. The IAU, right at the beginning of the pandemic, thought, well, we have to capture what is happening. And with colleagues in the office, we developed a global survey on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education to complement this book. I am very pleased to be one of the co-editors, and there are very many aspects there. But at the same time, in that period, we needed to sense also where we were going. And so in that first survey, the report showed a few things that are particular to also the point on inequality. We know, and this is something that everybody's saying, but it needs repeating, that COVID-19 affected the teaching and the learning and the research and the community engagement at all universities around the world. And the move online, as well of internationalization, as Dorothy just said, the move of teaching and learning, the shift to a different kind of research also in a virtual world, the internationalization dynamics that change, all of that, this change from face-to-face to distance teaching and learning, the whole digital transformation actually of the higher education system overnight, did, of course, as the book shows it very clearly, not come without challenges. The main ones being still today access to technical infrastructures, the access to better competencies and pedagogies for distance learning, and the requirements of specific field of studies, which made it possible for some to pivot online and others less so. Minister Harris said, and I will quote him here, he said, let's keep the show on the road. And indeed, that's what universities have been doing all the way since the beginning of the pandemic, yet managing higher education at a distance, and President Keogh showed that as well, is possible. But not everywhere in the world in the same way. It is possible to a certain extent, but too often has resulted very negatively on the quality of the activities and also increased inequality of learning or research opportunities. The efforts put in place to prevent a void academic year, to ensure future planning, despite the high degree of uncertainty, the risk of a decreasing private and potentially also public funding, all these efforts being addressed demonstrate the incredible amount of pressure on higher education institutions to cope during the current crisis, and at the same time, their resilience and the creativity. We have done also regional breakdown in the research report. And what the regional analysis shows is substantial differences between institutions around the world. You mentioned Africa and Latin America, and indeed in both in particular, we see that there is many challenges that we don't see in other places of the world. And this is probably due to a lower degree of access to technology in Africa than in other regions, but also in Latin America. We had a colleague from Brazil who said that the first few months of the pandemic, they had to run around campus, but also run around the city and run after their students to make sure they could provide them with the technical equipment that was required to give them a little opportunity to sit at this kitchen table that was mentioned earlier and to access the higher education that was provided to them through the little means that they had at the university. So too many countries and too many places are suffering from this incapacity to move online. And thus, there from the start, you have this inequality that is being stressed even further. So Africa is one of the regions reporting the biggest disruption on research. We had Barnabas yesterday in the THE Summit, which recognized the excellence of UCC today. You mentioned it earlier. But Barnabas, in that session that we had on the role of higher education for sustainable development and how important it is to work together, said that we don't know, and we will never be able to say before months, the enormous impact of the pandemic on higher education. He said that universities in Africa were on the way out, they were on the way up, they were on the way to actually catch up with universities around the world. And today they are back to square one, probably back some 20 years or so. So it's important to note that. It's important, as again, Minister Harris stated it in his opening remarks, it is important that we work together, that we increase collaboration, that we exchange like we do here in this space, that we bring people together, and that we understand where we can go. And the book is one of the examples to showcase what are the challenges and how they can be addressed. So the risk of growing inequality is not only in certain parts of the world, it is the case even in Europe, where we've heard many people in France even not being able to access online teaching and learning because simply they didn't have the bandwidth or the computers, or they were in remote regions where they could not access higher education, or where the universities or the staff did not have the skills required or the pedagogies they needed to provide for high quality higher education online. And so all of these do play in the hand of inequalities being grown over time. So it is essential to see how we will increase the opportunities to work together even better, to show what can be done, what is being developed in many different places, and how we can share on that. Because we will need in the future to make sure that goal 17, partnerships for the goals and partnerships for a better higher education for everyone, is coming together in a way that will enhance the capacity for universities to work with other universities and any other kind of higher education institutions, with the governments. And that was very nice again in Minister Harris's intervention, that there was this strong cooperation with governments, but that's not the case in too many countries, unfortunately, and could be enhanced, but also with the private sector and society at large. So maybe even that all these big companies who have benefited from the pandemic because we're using all their online tools could chip in quite a bit of support for higher education in the future in all those countries that need it. I would have more to say, but I think I will leave it at this. The book has more to share.
Thank you very much. That is a lot of very useful insights there. And you follow on from the Minister's reflections that while COVID didn't create inequality, it has certainly shone a light on it. And I think we could go further and to say that uneven development, which is how development happens, has become deeply, deeply impacted by the COVID crisis, the outcome of which we haven't really seen. You also point to the idea that people say in relation to the COVID vaccine, none of us are safe until we're all safe. I think that goes for the higher education system. Europe in particular would have a responsibility with regards to sub-Saharan Africa and to find partnerships, I think, in the future, which I'm sure we probably will. And in Ireland, certainly, there is that sort of commitment. Hilligje, thank you very much. Sjur is the last of our panelists at the moment. Sjur, I wanted to ask you things that have concerned you over the years, and that's the issue of university autonomy or institutional autonomy. How do you square that with good governance? There are people who would say that the state, society has to have a role in the running or the governance of universities to make them socially responsible. And the other one is academic freedom, which, as you probably heard, there's been a case in Ireland recently that has brought to the fore. But just on those two, how do you see those issues advancing in the European space specifically? Sure, over to you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Well, I think that there are two main arguments for why we need academic freedom and institutional autonomy. The first is democracy, and the second is quality. You cannot have democracy unless you have academic freedom and institutional autonomy. You also cannot have quality learning, teaching, and research. And I think, if I may, that as we also heard from the minister, that DCU is a good example of both. I really like to take this opportunity also to acknowledge and thank Derry, Ronnie, and everybody else at DCU for the important role that you play in developing international cooperation on the democratic mission of higher education, including its local democratic mission. Now, if you look at these issues, I think there's little doubt that COVID has challenged democracy. And in fact, to the point where ministers of education meeting in the framework of the Council of Europe about a month before they met as ministers of the Bologna process said explicitly that they would not let a public health crisis develop into a crisis of democracy. Now, if they say that, I think it's also because they're concerned it might. The immediate response, I think, to COVID was maybe twofold. First of all, it was national rather than international or European, which is something I think of a problem. And secondly, there was a lot of emergency legislation. Now, I think people accept emergency legislation if it's just for if the need is obvious and it's short-lived. But some governments are actually not very good at specifying how long the emergency legislation would be in place. And at least one government explicitly tried to make it permanent, at least without an end date. Now, that implies reduced democratic oversight, and that certainly also reduces academic freedom and institutional autonomy. And I will not pretend that it was the COVID crisis that drove, for example, the Central European University from Budapest to Vienna. But I do think that circumstances around the reaction to the COVID crisis, because you can guess which government didn't want to limit the emergency legislation, could make it more difficult for the university to return. And in fact, both Education International and Scholars at Risk do report that the number of serious violations of academic freedom and institutional autonomy are on the rise worldwide. They don't say this is just because of COVID, but they do say COVID is part of the reason. So I would definitely plead that, not least in an emergency situation, our values are essential. But some of the issues are less clear cut. I mean, when you talk about academic freedom, institutional autonomy for democracy, I think it's relatively clear cut. And yet, had everything been clear cut, we probably wouldn't have been discussing the issues. The issue of institutional autonomy, academic freedom, is also an issue about proper relationship between public authorities and the academic community, academic institutions. I'm not sure the COVID crisis as such has dramatically changed that, but it has probably reinforced some of the tendencies. Universities have rightly argued that campuses need to be kept open. And we heard a very clear plea from the minister at the beginning of this webinar that the Irish government will make every effort to reopen campuses in the fall. Now, universities have every right and every duty, I think, to make that argument. And yet they cannot unilaterally open campus. They cannot unilaterally disregard legislation or other policy measures of public health. And I think that, in a sense, illustrates some of the issues involved. Public authorities, I think, would be in the right to say, in the phase of this COVID crisis, we will allocate funding to research, to teaching programs that can meet the immediate crisis. Universities, of course, have a right to say whether they want to go for this or not, but I think they would not be fulfilling their responsibility to society if they said, we're not really interested in this. And the universities haven't. The universities have responded very well, both in teaching and research, to the COVID crisis. And for example, nursing students, medical students training to be doctors at advanced levels have helped out also in meeting the immediate needs. But they wouldn't be there doing their duty if all of a sudden they shifted everything they do onto COVID. So it's very much a question of balance. You cannot leave all priorities aside, but you can reprioritize. I come from a part of Europe where regional policy is very strong. My home country is Norway, and especially in the north and the west, there has been significant public policies to develop higher education in outlying areas. Again, I think that has been accepted. What would not be accepted, of course, is if the public authorities then say, we give you this university and you will teach this, this, and this, and this, and this way. So again, it's really one of the reasons for, maybe the main reason, apart from the political reasons, for why academic freedom and institutional autonomy are so complex, is that there are no clear-cut solutions. It's very much a question of balance rather than one or the other. So it's maybe to start us off, that could be enough in this round.
Sure, thank you very much. That has given us a very broad, wider range of issues and quite deep ones in terms of the public function of the university. I think at this stage it might be useful for us to try to answer very briefly the questions that have been posed. And Dorothy, I see the first question has got your name written on it, really. It's asking whether the regionalization of higher education might lead to a less commercial approach to internationalization following the pandemic. Is that something that you envisage?
I think it's quite hard to tell, actually. And I think it might be good to remember that approaches to internationalization are not uniform across the world. And I think there is a tendency sometimes to extrapolate and think that our own particular form of internationalization, our own particular approach to internationalization is everyone's approach to internationalization. I think if we look at some parts of the world, we'll see a very, very commercial approach to internationalization, where there is strong competition for international students as a moneymaker, basically. But I think in other parts of the world, there has been a much more cooperative approach to internationalization based on collaboration, based on partnerships, based on alliances, based perhaps more than looking for full-time degree-seeking students who pay high fees, looking for that truly intercultural and international learning through internationalization of the curriculum or through temporary mobility. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that, Ronnie. I think it very much depends on what our starting point was, and there's a huge diversity of starting points there around the world.
Dorothy, I think that's a fair response, but I mean, you are showing that there are options. It's not predestined to always be a commercial enterprise, that it has a much more educational, internationalist, intercultural dimension, or can do.
Absolutely. And I think it does already in many contexts around the world. I think that's the important point also.
That's good to hear. Now, I don't know who will be able to answer this. Kieran Dunn talks about LinkedIn, Future Learn, Google, having these large, well-resourced organizations that you referred to there. Are they going to be a threat to the traditional higher education sector, or are they partners that we may wish to collaborate with? Hilligje, would you care to answer?
Thank you for that question. It's an interesting one because it's popping up everywhere. I even heard yesterday at home at the dinner table that even, Amazon is going to take over the football the football championship. So these big businesses are trying to get in all the public spaces and higher education as well. And so they try, but they don't offer the same. It is absolutely not the same as the higher education experience as a whole. this is tailor-made. You can get a bit of training through any of these courses and opportunities, but it's like having a patchwork of little things that you would take here and there, and are very good opportunities for those who cannot attend a higher education and take the long road down higher education. So maybe they're needed and they're a good opportunity and a good addition. But the higher education institutions themselves will be there to stay. That's the future. That's how we can educate people into something else. That's where sometimes, even yesterday in another meeting in Greece, I travel a lot through platforms, but I was in Greece yesterday morning, and somebody said, but we need to train we need to produce graduates for the future. That's maybe what the other producers do, but higher education is educating into something different and is not producing any graduate. It is educating them into a whole that will allow them to address the world in a different way, along the lines set out also by Sjur. All these values-based possibilities for appropriation of knowledge that will make you a different person in life. But I see President Keogh.
Thank you ever so much. Dara, you'd like to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. As Hilligje said, people have asked that question forever. And in the 1920s, as you know, that they predicted that the movie theater would herald the end of the lecture. It's interesting. I think one of the important things is for us as educators, and particularly for the likes of ourselves at DCU, we're a public university, as we say, committed to the public good. It's not about modality. I mean, so much of the debate about the pandemic and education is about the modalities, the affordances of technology and so on. But I think a lot of our discussion is misplaced. It's about how we will do education in the future. I think it's more important that we would ask ourselves the why. You know, what is kind of the philosophical stance? You know, why do we do what we do? Why do students come towards us? And in that sense, again, I mean, I began by talking about the Great Famine and the impact of the Great Famine. Very significantly, that in the aftermath of the famine in 1850, 51, 52, John Henry Newman came to Dublin and penned that essay in the context of the Great Famine on the idea of a university. And I think that that's the challenge for all of us that brings everything together around the table here. Why do we do it? We would have at DCU very strong partnerships with LinkedIn and Facebook, Google and so on. We use their platforms, we use their learnings. I see my colleague, Professor Mark Brown here. We're partners in Future Learn. We have delivered free programs to the world on learning and learning in the pandemic. And I think Dorothy's point again about internationalization, and I see Greg Hess is here from IES in the United States. Internationalization is complex. Paul LeBlanc, who we all know in that kind of education, in that space, he has that metaphor about at different stages in your life, you want different things from a university. And it's that question, why will I go to university? Why do I want to learn? And he makes that analogy with the milkshake, that at different times of the day, you want something different from a milkshake. That in your breakfast, you want it to be lumpy, you want it to feel like substantial, you want it to be nourishing. Later in the day, you might want it for thirst and whatever. And I think there is that element in education as well. But I think the why now for me as a student, and why as a HEI or a provider, so I think that philosophical stance is actually very important.
And the why also for society.
Sorry,
the society itself. What kind of a society do we want? And so
exactly,
it's not a commodified one.
What can we hope for? You know,
the university is milkshake, and I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that other point that the other point about the rankings is the point is linked to that as well. I think. Yes. I'm not kind of jumping ahead, but I heard a colleague in Sciences Po say that, you know, the rankings, he said the rankings were like sausages. you know, if you knew what went into them, you wouldn't touch them. And there is an element of that, but all of us, like the purring around the room today when we're talking about the rankings, we like to do well in them. And I think that the alternatives like the U multi-rank and so on that took in accessibility, different things, never took off. But they're complicated. Sorry, Sjur has his hand up.
Thank you. Yes, Sjur, do you want to chip in there?
Yeah, if I could, maybe both on the rankings issue and then on the LinkedIn issue. I mean, there talked about the sausage. I mean, I'm not a big fan of rankings, and I'm kind of reminded of Tom Lehrer, who talked about sewers and said, "What you get out of it depends on what you put into it." And there is an analogy. I'm in two minds about rankings. On the one hand, I say, you know, let's try to make them go away. But on the other hand, the other more realistic strategy may be, let's have as many as possible so that they cancel each other out. I think a lot depends. I mean, why are the rankings given a certain importance? Because people use them, but they don't necessarily look at what goes into them, what they actually say. They can probably say something about research quality and natural science. I'm not sure they actually say very much about the quality of an institution as such. And I'm not sure that the answer is trying to develop rankings that, for example, rank our COVID response or our social engagement agenda, etc. I'm not sure that the methodology is reliable, and I'm not sure they actually say what they pretend to say. So part of it, I think, is universities not giving undue importance to rankings, including in their marketing and their promotion to new students. But it's also about public authorities not using rankings for purposes for which the rankings cannot be used. And that, in a sense, perhaps leads also to the question about LinkedIn, etc. If you're after a specific skill that can be developed quite quickly, that might be a good answer. But I would say education, as all the others have said, is about much more. It's about putting things together into a coherent whole. You don't get an education by taking 5 credits in history, 5 credits in Spanish, 5 credits in mathematics, etc. And that's really where the education system comes in. I mean, the education system is something that puts things together into a coherent whole. If you have an Irish master's degree and it comes from DCU, you know that the DCU is a recognized Irish university. So you can trust that the master's degree would be at the level it claims to be. It would have been quality assured, and the workload would be what it claims to be. These are questions that, as a user of the qualification, as an employer, as a public authority, or as a student considering taking a degree, you would not necessarily have those answers for a degree or a course that's not linked to an institution or to an education system.
Sure, thank you very much. We are running out of time, and it's very real because there is another event planned for the same Zoom platform in literally 5 minutes. What I was going to propose now is a bit of a trick question here for the panel. The COVID crisis was not one of these unknown unknowns. This was something that was really quite well known in those circles. So why did it happen? Why did it overpower us? So thinking now of the universities that we're all in, if Minister Harris was to call you up afterwards and say, I need one bright idea from you, something I really must address in my next strategy document. I'd like to ask each of you, I was going to ask for 2, but given the time, just one issue that you think it needs to be addressed. It could be the funding crisis, it could be widening participation, you name it. It'll be interesting to see if we have commonality. Can we start with you, Dara? One thing you'd like Simon Harris to address?
One thing.
Issue, define it how you want the question.
One of the things that pointed that I think we saw, I think communication was absolutely critical, and the kind of singular voice and the lack of ambiguity. Sjur made the point earlier about the autonomy of institutions, and yet we have to work within frameworks, and those frameworks changed very rapidly, and the decision making wasn't always apparent. I think for us within the university, what we have tried to do is to be as absolutely clear as we could be around communication. You might get the decisions wrong, but if people know why you make the decision and the reason you're making the move. So I think that kind of clear and unambiguous communication.
Thanks, that's something I can certainly testify was widely perceived in DCU as being very clear. People may not have liked certain decisions, but they were clear. Dorothy, you're sending the minister a note this evening. What are you going to tell him to do?
What would I ask him to do? I think it has to do with supporting collaborative initiatives,
Okay.
partnerships, in particular, of course, international partnerships from my perspective. And the message there would have to be flexible regulation, flexibility in regulations to allow universities to move forward in these partnerships, which I think are essential in the educating, and again, I share the not training, but educating of citizens for the 21st century who are aware of the challenges and live up to the expectations society places in them as leaders of the future.
Okay, thank you. So it's collaboration and partnerships underpinned by flexible regulations, not, in other words, the law of the jungle and pure competitiveness as the driver of excellence.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Hilligje, from your perspective, what's the big issue that you would like to see addressed?
I would say, and he said it in a way, but I would say higher education matters and matters all around the world. And all kinds of higher education institutions and universities in particular are needed to address the issues that we're facing today. And we need to have the opportunity for the many to attend many kinds of institutions, but of high quality, as Sjur was saying before. And the high quality comes with a perspective on sustainable development, ethics and integrity, value-based educations. These are the components that I would certainly advise should be integrated into higher education systems, into higher education institutions, strategies all around the world.
Thank you, Hilligje. I'm taking out of that fairly wide panorama the issue of ethics and value-based understanding of education, that it's not just a passport to a job, it is education, it is based on ethics and values. Certainly our international network has come around the values-based issue. So finally, Sjur, would you want to tell us?
I would say make sure that all students and prospective students have an opportunity to fulfill both their potential and their aspirations. And that means many of them will need particular support, especially those who come from backgrounds that are perhaps where they have few academic role models, where there's little encouragement, and where the material conditions may also not necessarily be the best. I think that means you have to balance, it's really a lot of question about balance. In this case, also balance online provision and face-to-face provision. It's not one or the other. And you also need to look at the education system as a whole, because if you start only with the people who are at an age where they can access universities, for many it will be too late. You need to develop aspirations and potentials before that. You also know our colleagues at Queen's University, and they work with the community center, and they do that because the community center is about a mile away from campus. But the people said, we walk past Queen's every day, we never dreamed of stepping onto campus. And that is changing. COVID or not COVID, that is tremendously important. And I think DCU is fulfilling exactly that role also in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sjur. I would just add, from my perspective, really the issue of inequality, the issue of uneven development, which has been running through things, One I'm familiar with from colleagues in South Africa in particular is the digital divide. We have that same issue in DC and the community, teaching locally in North Dublin. The digital divide is a huge impediment to good education, basically. We have covered a lot of ground.
No.
It's best to be unmuted. I would like to really thank the audience. I'm very aware from having gone to events like this by the Royal Irish Academy that there's a sense that you're sitting in the dark and you're listening. It's not been our intention, but I think it's just the numbers that started off at 180 have made that. But what I'd commit to do is that we're going to write this up. We're going to get Minister Harris's speech, put it on our website, and perhaps if Dara is agreeable, that we keep the discussion going in some way. It is the big discussion of anyone in a university or interested in a university, what happens after COVID. Dara, any final thoughts? We've got 1 minute to close.
No, just to thank everybody again for coming. It's great to see so many people around the world who are absolutely committed to this issue. As Michael Crow's point, we are a force together in higher education, and it's great to see us all moving and guided by a similar star. So great to see everybody, and have a good day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dara. Thank you, everybody.